Hello, everybody. Welcome back to We're Talking Movies. As always, I'm Andrew Duvall, and I'm joined by my co-host and friend, Cade Bonzel. And we finally did it, folks. We've made it to Scream 3. Oh, boy. We have a lot to say about this movie. Cade, you want to start off with the few pros that we do have?
Sure. So one of the biggest pro that I have with this movie would have to be, well, one of the biggest pros I had with Scream 2 as well is the main trio of the film, and that is Sidney Prescott along with Dewey Riley and Gale Weathers, all played by Nev Campbell, David Arquette, and Courtney Cox. So that is still the heart of this movie, just like it was Scream 2 and the first Scream, in my opinion. So their chemistry together, the three of them, is always so great to see. And I love them as characters and I love their interactions. Yeah, they're always something that I look forward to seeing when I watch these movies.
And I agree, and I definitely think I like how everybody kind of evolves in this movie. Like this is definitely the movie where Dewey and Gale really start getting close to each other.
Yeah, and I think it's also the movie where they kind of shine the most.
I can agree with that. I think I don't know. I just think them together is always really nice to see, especially because was it at this point where Courtney Cox and David Arquette were married in real life, or was that just after this?
I think that was just after this. It might have been around the same time, but yeah.
And you can definitely see their real life chemistry, and they're just kind of enjoyable to watch because you got Dewey, who's pretty lovable and adorable, and then you got Gale, who's kind of a witch to everybody, and feel free to change the first letter of that word. But you can see her kind of opening up and kind of starting to crack a little bit, and starting to fall for Dewey's charms. And then Sidney Prescott's always a joy to watch. Plus, I like that they start showing that she's maybe starting to trust people again, like when she starts showing developing the relationship with the police detective played by Patrick Dempsey, whose character name is eluding me at this moment. And they expound on that in later Scream sequels as well. So
Yeah, I agree. And aside from that, but another big pro that I have with this movie is actually it comes from the character of Randy, especially in his video where he presents himself to everybody and he leaves behind the last, rules for the trilogy ender. That video that he leaves behind, when we see Randy, it honestly kind of felt like a breath of fresh air in the movie. And it was a good like reminder of what we have lost throughout these films. We lost Randy in the second movie, and seeing him again, it kind of brought back some, I guess, some life and some kind of spark because he just brings that kind of presence on the screen with his character.
yeah, the kind of lovable doofus, but who always is still able to provide something helpful. Yeah, and I think the fact that it was like a videotape that they left behind was probably the best way to do it, as opposed to just bringing him back to life, which I'm sure everybody would have hated because that's not how this franchise works.
Right. And I think what's nice about it is that when he has his video, when he leaves behind the rules, he says, number one, you have a killer who's going to be superhuman. Anyone, including the main character, can die, and the past is going to come back. All of those rules are actually very true. That usually does happen in a trilogy, especially in a trilogy's, in the third movie, especially in a horror franchise. And I think that if you look back at it, yeah, those rules are pretty accurate. So I do credit the writers for acknowledging that.
Yeah, and the fact that all of that kind of well, obviously the main character doesn't die in this one, but the fact that they also follow up on a good chunk of that, I think also helps.
Yeah. And but lastly, my other pro about this movie, I want to talk about this with you because it is also a big con that I have. But here's why it's a pro. It has to do with the killer, and that killer is Roman Bridger. Now, despite how we feel about his character, here is one thing that I think we should acknowledge about him as a character. If you look at the entire franchise, he is the only killer who has actually been an individual killer, and he's also the one who has killed the most victims throughout his own film. So if you think about it, despite how we feel about his character, which we'll get into, if you think about it, he really is the most accomplished killer in the entire franchise.
And now that you've pointed that out, that makes sense, and B is incredibly disheartening.
Well, why don't we talk about why it makes sense? What do you mean?
Because well, number one, this film does have the highest kill count of the series, if I'm not mistaken.
Right.
I don't remember. I don't think Scream 6 overtook it. I think it got close.
Yeah, I think Scream 4 is the closest after this one, actually.
Is it 4? Really?
Yeah. Well, but moving on, let's get back to Roman.
Uh, Honestly, I really don't even have that many good things to say about it.
All right. Well, why don't we get into our
I
con?
do, however, have one good con, not about Roman, I do need to mention.
Okay, go ahead.
This movie has a great soundtrack.
It does
Like
have a great
a
soundtrack.
really
Yeah.
good soundtrack. Like this came out in 2000, and damn, this soundtrack basically reflects that kind of late 90s new metal screamo rock movement, because you got Slipknot, Finger 11, System of a Down, Seven Dust, Godsmack, Cold Chamber. Like, damn, this is a great reflection of the late 90s, early 2000s.
Yeah, it is. But yeah, why don't we get into our cons now? I think the first thing we should just talk about, because we were just talking about it a minute ago, is the character of Roman Bridger. You want to start?
Oh my god, this character. Okay. Point number one, let me tell you a little story. The first time I watched this movie, it was just for the sake of the fact that I was working my way through the franchise. When I watched the movie for the first time and Roman revealed himself as the killer, I genuinely didn't remember who the hell he was. He is that level of forgettable and pointless, and just the few times he's on screen, he's just this really whiny, rat faced little character. I'm like, we're supposed to believe this guy is a criminal mastermind who not only orchestrated the murders in this movie, but spoiler alert, apparently orchestrated, told Billy and Stu, directed them in the first movie, and also oversaw how the killing of Sydney's mom, that got Cotton Weary imprisoned. This guy, this guy, who again, he took off the mask for ask, and I'm like, who are you?
It's Roman Bridger, dude. Come on.
Ooh. Okay, that's number one, is the fact that he's completely unforgettable and totally unbelievable as a mastermind. And number three, and this is my least favorite, Sydney didn't have any freaking clue who he was. You go back and watch the movie, Sydney never meets him before this. So he takes the mask off, starts explaining this, and Sydney's like, who the hell are you? I have no idea who you are. At least with the other ghost faces, she'd at least met them before and could recognize them on sight. This guy, like, what's your name again? Oh, you're secretly my half brother here that just got tacked on to the end of this story, because let's make this killer reveal even more convoluted. Oh my god, worst part is Roman's not even the part of this movie I hate the most.
Okay, yeah, I think I know what you're talking about. Why don't we get onto that?
Okay. The voice changer.
The voice changer. Yes.
Okay. The voice box thing, that's been part of Scream since the beginning, and it's still even to this day.
Yes, it is.
But that's a voice distorter. Okay, that's something you can basically buy at any Halloween or joke shop. This thing, where it somehow makes your voice sound like literally everybody else on the planet, that technology did not exist in the year 2000, and it doesn't even exist in the year 2023. And the fact that this whole freaking movie is tied to this one stupid device kind of brings down the quality of the whole freaking film. And again, this is the thing I hate the most in this franchise, in this entire franchise, is this one stupid plot point that doesn't exist and is even today, and is somehow perfect enough to fool some of the best horror protagonists of all time.
And then they never bring it back for any of the sequels.
Oh yeah, I didn't even think about that. Like, oh, this amazing technology exists. This is clearly going to be in the rest of the franchise. Nope, they never bring it back. Like, is this the only freaking device of its kind that exists? And Roman just built this in his garage? Somehow built, cutting edge voice technology? Okay. So there's that. And now let's talk about another low point for this franchise, the house blowing up scene.
Okay, go ahead.
So in this scene, Ghostface's plan is to somehow sneak into the house, turn the gas on without being noticed, and then disappear somewhere else to send a fax that one of the characters just has to go back in to get. And his entire plan depends on the fact that this character is going to grab the fax, and for some reason, and the only way it works is that character grabs a lighter and ignites the house. What was Ghostface's backup plan if this character grabbed a flashlight or took it outside to read it under the streetlight? It is so convoluted and stupid. Oh my god, I hate this movie. I hate this movie.
I can tell. I can tell. But you know what? Why don't we get on to another con? So here's a con that I have, and I think you can agree because it was also a con that I had with Scream 2. And that is that this movie does not really work as a standalone story all that well. And I understand that it's the final movie in the trilogy, and a lot of it is about going back. But at the same time, you do want, even though you're trying to pay homage to the first two, at the same time, you do want to have your own story. But again, there is required reading for this movie to exist. And it can't exist without the first movie because it recreates a lot of elements from the first one. And also, if you think about it, I mean, I get that it's the climax of the first two movies, but it just relies too heavily on the past to exist.
Yeah, and again, especially like, yeah, Scream 2 kind of did that, but this one especially does that because otherwise, if you watch this one without watching the first two, you're like, wait, who's Billy and Stu? What's the importance of them killing Sydney's mom? Who's Cotton Weary?
Well, and that's another thing, and this goes back to what we were talking about with Roman. So this is a con that I have with Roman. So the thing is, we find out that he's the one who orchestrated the murder of Sydney's mom and also was basically responsible for all the killings in the first movie. I kind of wish that he had no connection to Billy and Stu or any of the other killers because here's the thing. So in the second movie, Mrs. Loomis and Mickey, they were both teamed up. Mrs. Loomis was the one with the connection to Billy because she was his mom. And in this, we find out that Roman is Sydney's brother, and also he was the one who manipulated Billy into committing all the murders. I kind of wish that they didn't repeat that same idea of the killers being connected. I wish that there was no connection with the other killers with this movie. I think it would have been more interesting.
Yeah, I think honestly, I think it would have been better. It's like, oh, Roman's committing these murders because he wants to, go down in infamy and make his movie more infamous. Because believe it or not, there has actually been examples of that happening. I believe it was 2006. There was a Swedish author that was arrested for murder because he had written a book basically based on the murder that he had committed, and after he was arrested, his book sales skyrocketed.
Maybe. But what I think is, yeah, that's just a con that I have with Roman's character. I do get all the things that you were ranting about, but yeah, that's a con that I have with him. Does that make any sense or not really?
No, it makes sense. I just think there's so much worse to talk about.
Well, I'll tell you what, why don't we talk about this? Because I did want to bring this up. I wanted to talk about the original concept for the film. And originally, it was supposed to be, and if this is true, what I've read online, so the original story, again, if it's true, was that a group of fans of the Stab movies, the fictional franchise in the Scream movies, it was going to be about like a whole following of the fans banding together to create this ghost face, I guess, sort of cultish following of killers, and they would all commit the murders together. And I guess that was the concept that was rejected. But now that I think about it, I think it could have been a intriguing concept to explore. But what do you think? Would you have liked to have seen that instead of this one?
Yes. I think that's different than the first two movies with the big group of killers, which is something that I've been hoping the franchise has done for a long time. Still hasn't quite done that yet.
That might happen with Scream 7 for all we know.
Well, let's wait and see what Scream 7 looks like because that still seems like several years in the future. But oh my God, anything would have been better than what we got in this movie. This is, it's not the worst horror movie I've ever made. It's not the worst horror movie I've ever seen.
Do you think that Wes Craven's direction kind of saves it from being one of the worst?
Yeah, because Wes Craven always has a touch that there's always enjoyable parts of his movies, even if they're not always wall to wall great. Like again, I do enjoy the main three, the trio in this movie. I enjoy Dewey and Gail's relationship. There's a couple of decent kills. Like I actually quite like the kill in the wardrobe room, but oh my god, it's just weighed down by just so much terribleness. And I understand there's apparently a lot of rewrites, even into production. They were rewriting it, and there was a lot of issues behind the scenes. with Dimension Pictures and just, but oh my God.
Tell you what, why don't we end this review with our rating for this movie? What would you give this on a scale of 1 to 10? Because I think I would give it a 5.5 or maybe potentially a 6. That's where I would go.
4.
4? Okay.
I I really don't like this movie. Again, it's not the worst horror movie I've ever seen, but it's definitely the most disappointing. Because Scream is one of my all-time favorite horror movies, and Scream 5 and 6 are two of my favorite horror sequels. But right now, we're kind of in the doldrums of the franchise.
Yeah. But we'll see what happens in the future, especially with Scream 7.
Yeah, that's just, oh, I'm just sad now. All right, so that concludes our very interesting synopsis and review of Scream 3. Please be sure to like and subscribe. And as always, this has been the We're Talking Movies show. I'm Andrew. I'm forever joined by my friend Cade, and please tune in next time.
Bye.